It is, I don't know about you all, but it's been a while since I've been at a conference like this. And it is like drinking from a fire hose. All this great information you all are sharing has been phenomenal. This morning's plenary session was absolutely incredible. Matthew, Victor, Emily, and David are doing incredible work to address global hunger and migration. It was interesting to hear about the interconnectedness of all these issues. Now, we probably intuit that COVID is going to have a direct impact on global hunger, and we certainly intuit that climate change is going to have an impact on global hunger, or that conflict and destabilization has an impact on global food security. But thinking about the intricacies of what's happening in the Ukraine and on the Ukrainian-Russian border and its effects on the east coast of Africa, and the impacts that it's having. I've had a number of conversations with state leaders on the eastern coast of Africa who've told us that they have their agricultural system is largely based on access to fertilizer that they buy from that area. In Sri Lanka, where one of our speaker this afternoon has spent a good bit of time, the same situation is there, and they are expecting to produce 30% less, or 30% total of what they typically produce each year with their rice yield. And so we know of that direct effect both on economic security and food insecurity. And so to be able to hear from experts who are addressing this issue, who are swimming downstream, to think through how we comprehensively address hunger through an economic lens and reduce the need for migration so that families can stay in their own communities was really special to hear this morning. We have another treat. And so oftentimes we think about domestic hunger and we think about global hunger as two separate issues. And they're not. I mean, we're one country, amidst countries all across the planet. And we have had the good fortune and the resources in an agriculturally rich nation to be able to address food insecurity from the get-go. But we certainly struggle with that as a country. But we are one nation amidst many around the world. And we have seen this spike in global hunger to the point where we now have over 300 million people on the brink of starvation and hunger and malnutrition globally. So how do we begin to address it? What is our nation doing about it? Today we get to hear from a leader at USAID, or USAID. USAID is the world's premier international development agency, and it's a catalytic actor in driving and developing results. USAID works to help lift lives, build communities, and advance democracy. USAID's work advances U.S. national security and economic prosperity. It demonstrates American generosity and promotes a path to recipient self-reliance and resilience. All the things that we were hearing echoed out of this morning's session as a need for our way in which we engage the global community. So I'd like to introduce to you all one of the leaders at USAID, Maura Barry Boyle. Maura serves as the Senior Deputy Assistant to the Administrator, and in USAID language, the Administrator is the Chief Executive. That would be Ambassador Power. In USAID, she serves in USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security and is the interim USAID Global Water Coordinator. In this role, she oversees the implementation of the agency's responsibility under the U.S. Global Water Strategy. Ms. Barry also oversees the Bureau's strategy, program, budget, and administrative functions, which support implementation of both Water for the World and Feed the Future initiatives. Prior to joining RFS, she served as the deputy of the Center for Excellence in Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance at USAID and their Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. Before returning to Washington, she served for a year as the acting deputy chief of the mission in the U.S. Embassy in Jamaica. And prior to that, she spent decades living around the world, addressing these issues with proximity directly to the problem. I said that I think she needs to be the new Dos Equis spokesperson as the most interesting person in the world. With that in mind, would you please welcome Maura Barry Boyle to the stage?
Thank you, Jeremy, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm literally here at the table with you, so glad to be here for this summit and to discuss such an important issue. Yeah, really happy to be here. It sounds like you've had a good few days discussing topics, so I'm here to talk a little bit about USAID and the work that we do and sort of the lens of international development. So thank you for the introduction, Jeremy. And I always like to tell people I started my career, well, I don't want to say how many years ago, but more than 30, as a Peace Corps volunteer in Western Kenya, and spent the majority of my career living and working in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in the Caribbean, in the former Soviet Union. So in a number of places, and have seen, up close some of the problems that we're discussing in terms of food insecurity and famine, even in some cases. So I think, being here today, this event this week that you're having really just comes at such a critical time when the world is really feeling the impact of so many shocks, and it's really having an impact on people's lives. And there's an increase in hunger and poverty here in the United States and around the world. And I think that the last few years have really shown us that when there's a shock on a food system in one part of the world, it can quickly, just sort of and immediately send an enduring ripple across the globe. And so we know that vulnerable countries right now are really coping with multiple shocks. And I was a few weeks ago, last month, in Kigali in Rwanda, where they had an annual event it's called AGRF. I won't tell you what that stands for because they've changed the name, so I'll tell you what it stands for now, which is an annual African Food Systems Summit that brings together ministers of agriculture, some heads of state, private sector, civil society, on an annual basis to really drum up a conversation around issues of food security, and see also really with the private sector how we can bring the public and the private sector together. And a big piece of that is having a deal room that USAID supports to really try and leverage resources and whatnot. So that conversation was really exciting to be a part of, and also to be in person. I had gone last year in person in Nairobi, but most of it was hybrid. This year, I think it was 98% in person. They had about 3,000 people there. And Agnes Kilibata, who runs AGRA and was the special envoy for the UN Food Systems Summit last October, really heads up that event. And if any of you in the room have had a chance to meet her, she's an amazing individual, former Minister of Agriculture from Rwanda. So great to spend time with her and so many leaders. And one of the themes, which I understand, and Jeremy, you referred to it, and I know everyone's talking about the 3 C's or the 4 C's or maybe the 5 C's, right? Of course, there's COVID. There's climate change, there's conflict, there's the rise in the cost of living, there's maybe corruption as part of that conversation. So that was very much a theme that was discussed in this discussion, talking about the impact of what's happening in terms of food security in the African continent. And then they discussed the 3 F's, and don't get any funny ideas about the F's, but the 3 F's were fertilizer, fuel, and food, right? We see these rising costs on all 3 and the impact that's having on the cost of living. And then there were the 3 A's, which I understand you've been discussing here also, and that's action, action, action. I mean, we're at a moment in time where we have so much attention on the issue of hunger and poverty like we haven't seen in so long. I mean, the President of the United States is focused on this issue, and I think while it's a crisis, we have to all, since we're all working in this space, find ways to take advantage of using the attention that's on it now, because it's not going away, and take advantage of that and see what we can leverage out of that from governments, from private sector, and all of us working in different aspects in civil society and et cetera. When I was at this event in Kigali, I threw in 3 I's, so I'd like to share those with you also. And one was innovation, and I think innovation is very much about a lot of the discussion that you would be having here. I know we have some of our USAID innovation labs here, but innovation, and then the second I being investment. So how can we leverage more investment from the private sector, from the public sector, into these innovations and move them out and scale them and get them sort of on that last mile delivery to farmers who really need them. And then the third I that I threw in was the I of inclusion, because I think really the work that we do, if we're not inclusive in our approach, then we're not going to ever be as impactful as we possibly could. So I think it's really important to underscore inclusion, and working with the most marginalized groups and really underscoring the need to really pay close attention to women as we address issues around food security, hunger, and poverty. We know that Russia's invasion on Ukraine is really exacerbating all of these conditions. And Jeremy, as you mentioned, I mean, there's millions of people that are being impacted and facing really unprecedented levels of hunger right now across the globe. And I think it's just, that the other risk that we have right now, it's not just the rising hunger and poverty and malnutrition, but also the risk of, undoing a lot of hard-won development gains that we've made over the last couple of decades. We really see, like, for the first time, levels of extreme poverty are starting to rise again, and that's really concerning. We know that food insecurity is forcing vulnerable families and communities to make very difficult choices here in the United States and globally. Very difficult choices when you sit down at the table, and not having access to affordable, nutritious food to feed to your family. And those choices will carry long-term impacts on the health and the well-being, particularly of small children. We know that stunting is something that a lot of children around the globe suffer from, and the impacts are permanent. As I mentioned, too often it's women and children that are disproportionately bearing the burden when there's not enough to eat. And for smallholder farmers and communities and businesses that depend on smallholder farmers, we have seen how the global shocks can send essential inputs like fertilizers, the price just skyrocketing. And this is going to result in less production, less food being produced, and less food available to put on the table when it comes to harvest time globally. So I think all of this sort of background, I know you've been discussing it over the last few days, but it really makes conversations like the one that is taking place here right now just so essential. And I think, I really want to take the opportunity to thank the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty for convening such an important conference and bringing all these actors together in person. I think one of the things I'd like to do is share a little bit about how the United States government is addressing issues of global hunger and poverty and malnutrition. And some of you may be familiar with, you mentioned the Feed the Future initiative. That initiative, that U.S. government initiative, was born out of the last global food price crisis in 2007, 2008. And it's an initiative that falls under what we call the Global Food Security Act, and we have a global food security strategy. So under that, we have a Feed the Future initiative, and USAID leads the coordination on that, together with 12 other U.S. government agencies. USDA was here yesterday. They're one of the prime. State Department is prime, Peace Corps, a number of agencies that participate in that. And USAID Administrator Samantha Power is the coordinator of the Feed the Future initiative. And even beyond that initiative, I wanted to just remind ourselves that, the U.S., in terms of the global community and addressing global development, the U.S. over the last really 50 years has been the largest contributor to global development and to ending and aiming to provide humanitarian assistance to address issues of hunger and malnutrition. And I think that in and of itself is a real testament to the humanity of American people. And it's not just about the humanity of American people, though. It's really our understanding that food security is also about national security, Jeremy. And you mentioned national security, and we know that food security is important to that. when we look at the role of the United States in ending global hunger, it's important that we really underscore that it's not only a moral imperative. In an increasingly interconnected and borderless world, stability and prosperity of communities around the world directly impact U.S. interests. If we look back to 2007, 2008, when there's a food price crisis, we saw an uprising in a number of countries, particularly in the Middle East, because of the lack or the high prices of food. I know it's a combination of things that are happening in Sri Lanka right now that have led to all of these uprisings, but certainly the increase in the cost of food and fertilizer is contributing to that greatly. So the role of the United States is really important in addressing this global problem. And we know that, for example, many American-made food products, and we could ask our partners here from Hornell, but many products depend on foreign commodities. And by protecting and strengthening key parts of U.S. businesses' supply chains, Feed the Future can directly promote U.S. economic prosperity, and it also supports a lot of U.S. jobs. And today we're leveraging our resources and our partnerships at every level to meet the global food security crisis that we face today. And so last month at the UN General Assembly that took place in New York, if anyone was paying attention to that, you would have heard President Biden announce over $2.9 billion in new assistance from the US government to address the immediate and long-term effects of the global food security crisis. That's on top of already since Russia's war on Ukraine started, the US has contributed very generously, particularly on the humanitarian side, to this food crisis. It's been somewhere in the range of, I don't know the exact figure, but let's say it's about $8 billion. So it's been tremendous donation from the United States. That has also included resources to address not just the life-saving humanitarian assistance, but also to look at root causes and sort of immediately address those medium and longer term issues. So with that announcement that President Biden made last month, it included $140 million in new development funding that is aimed at accelerating what we're calling last mile delivery of agricultural tools, technology, production methods to really help smallholder farmers to be able to boost their productivity and their incomes. And I'm happy to talk about that more later, and we can open this up for a Q&A. But I think that kind of initiative gets at the core of a lot of what we do under Feed the Future through partnering with innovation labs and research, and then sort of last mile delivery partners on the ground, implementing partners. Many of them are faith-based organizations that help us get to those farmers that are the most vulnerable. That announcement from President Biden also included $2 billion in emergency assistance that will help save lives in countries that are really facing the food security crisis the hardest. And it includes food and nutrition assistance, health care, safe drinking water, protection for the most vulnerable, and some other vital relief. And Jeremy, you mentioned, the crisis in the Horn of Africa, and the severity of that is just, it's heartbreaking, really. This is the 4th year in a row that the Horn of Africa is experiencing drought, and we know that more than 20 million people are on the brink of facing starvation. So it's quite a serious situation. As you know from the hunger and poverty alleviation work that you all do, responding to a crisis, as I already said, we need both this immediate life-saving support, but we also need immediate investments in longer-term solutions. So some of the USAID humanitarian assistance takes the form of food aid, where we supply directly food aid, staples like sorghum and split peas, and enriched cooking oil that can help sustain those who lack access to food. But the global community, I think, has long realized that hunger cannot be fought with food alone. So even in very difficult situations, we know that markets still stay open. So one of our approaches is looking at providing immediate cash assistance, because sometimes that can be a lot faster and more effective at staving off hunger. And it also can help boost local economies. And in some countries, they already have some level of social safety nets where we're working. And so, for example, we may be providing cash assistance through mobile phone delivery and find that can be a very impactful and fast way to get out cash. And while humanitarian aid is critical for saving lives, it doesn't generally leave countries, communities, or farmers better able to weather the next failed harvest. And so as we see more shocks coming, whether they're from climate, whether they're from the next pandemic, whether they're from, conflict, we are looking at how can we invest in resilience and help countries withstand, or communities at least, be able to recover and adapt quickly. I mean, the climate crisis right now, we talked about the drought that's hitting the Horn of Africa. I mean, here, just driving in, this is my first time to Waco, but Cody, who drove me in, I asked her, does it always look like this? Because it looks kind of dry, So I know that, there's drought hitting much of the U.S. My gosh, the devastating Hurricane Ian that just hit Florida, I mean, how are people going to recover? Lives are impacted for a very long time. The good news, I think, on that is we are seeing, now 10 years into the Feed the Future initiatives, that communities where we have made consistent investments on working with those communities in an integrated approach to help them with things like drought-resistant seed or whatever it might be, they have withstood, we were able to do some quick studies from the impact of COVID. In particular, we looked at some communities in Malawi and some communities in, I think it was Tanzania, so don't quote me, but where we actually could see that those communities were better able to withstand the shock of the pandemic. Not to say that they weren't impacted, but they were better able to withstand it than neighboring communities where we had not worked. So the Feed the Future initiative, it was designed to give countries and work with countries that really do have that agricultural potential production. Because we know, I mean, the research is really clear that particularly in countries that are lower income countries or lower middle income countries, when you invest in agriculture, it's the fastest way to lift people up out of poverty. And so it's a really, really smart. And also on the research side, investing in research and agriculture just helps countries, the evidence is there, just lift themselves up out of poverty much faster. So Feed the Future is $1 billion a year. It may sound like a lot of money, $1 billion a year. It is a very generous amount of money from the US taxpayers, but the problem is enormous. But so it's $1 billion a year investment in food security. And for this past decade, our targeted investments have always received very broad bipartisan support, and that's really excellent because I think it just demonstrates again the humanity of the American heart on this issue. The Feed the Future is addressing root causes of poverty, hunger, and malnutrition around the world. And helping to support countries overcome crisis. So for instance, we're working with local partners and the private sector businesses to ensure farmers can access and better afford the rising price of fertilizer so that they can grow more crops. So what this looks like, as an example, we're partnering with, in Ghana, we're partnering with Yara International, which is a large fertilizer company, to reach farmers, smallholder farmers in Ghana. And Yara has made available $20 million of free fertilizer, and USAID has partnered with them, together with some other local partners on the ground, to help ensure that that fertilizer that they're making available is reaching that last mile, those smallholder farmers that they intend to reach. I mean, of course, as a fertilizer business, they want to keep their customers. And the truth of the matter is, in places like Africa, not that many farmers are using fertilizer because they couldn't afford it before this crisis. And now, those that were buying, we want to find ways to make sure that they keep using fertilizer in the way that in the most efficient way that they can to increase production. And so that support in Ghana is going to help 100,000 farmers. Another example is supporting local companies such as Good Nature Agro, which is a company based in Zambia. And they're reaching smallholder farmers with high-quality legume seeds that don't even require fertilizer. So here there's been an innovation, and the company is also providing farmers, with the training and the connections to premium markets that allow farmers to garner a higher price for their crops. And we're placing greater emphasis on connecting farmers and small agribusinesses with innovations such as improved drought-tolerant and nutrition-dense seeds. That's a big area that we're investing in. And so I recently, when I was in Rwanda, I also visited Kenya, and I was able to see some of this work, which I've seen numerous times, but this is my most recent visit last month, to see some of this work up close. And our missions now have been investing in this area because we have target Feed the Future countries that we work in. It's fluxed over the years of the 10-year initiative. We just recently expanded from 12 to 20 target countries. Rwanda and Kenya are both target countries, so we can see where we're crowding in our resources for better impact, what is happening on the ground. So while I was in Kenya, I went up to the drought-affected area of the northeast of the country, to Samburu and Isiolo. I was able to meet with some mothers in Samburu that are, that community, they rely on livestock. They're pastoralists, and they're being just hit so hard. And some of the assistance that USAID is providing is ready-to-use therapeutic food. It's emergency ready-to-use therapeutic food, RUTF. Our administrator had announced back in July a USAID commitment in partnership with UNICEF to put $200 million into that initiative. And the good thing about that was leveraging additional $250 million from philanthropic agencies and other foundations. That you can't just hand out the RUTF, and it was interesting to be on the ground and talk to some of these mothers. Those of you that are familiar with it, right? And there's different types. There's some for severe malnutrition, and there's some for moderate malnutrition. But you can't just give the packet out and think that's going to solve the problem, because honestly, the mother, will not just have the one child. She may have 5 or 6 children, and she's going to share it. But communicating and having that education there to say, no, actually, this child has to have these packets, has to go to this child who's severely malnourished, or you're not going to be coming back here with this child. Like it's a very serious situation. But it was interesting to see the partnerships that we had on the ground with local organizations to really put that emphasis on the training part of this nutrition package. And then when I was in Kigali, I got to see some really interesting and innovative work that we're doing with the private sector. One thing that I visited was a high-capacity mechanical maize sorting facility, where the maize sorting facility is weeding out all of the aflatoxin maize. And so it was a really innovative, interesting, small company, which you could see, wow, you could really scale this in the region. Really interesting work happening in Kigali. I have to say, and I know I'm talking about Rwanda a lot, but it's because where I was recently, and I think it reflects a lot of the work that USAID is doing in food security, but I had not been in that country in 20 years. And so if any of you have been there, the first time I was there was 30 years ago. I was there right before the genocide took place. I went back 10 years later, and I saw already changes taking place. They had already made improvements, but now, go 20 years later, anybody in the room been to Kigali? A few. I mean, the transformation, at least on the economic side, is incredible. They've really put in the infrastructure, and the government's really invested in that a lot. And it was interesting to see the impact, right, that is happening on people's lives. They still have a long way to go, because stunting is really high in Rwanda still, but they've made some incredible progress. And I know that the U.S. government has been partners with them in their efforts. Want to say that Feed the Future, of course, is having similar positive impacts in other regions of the world, such as Latin America and the Caribbean, and I know that you've been talking about those regions. And today, 1/3 of the world's food is produced in the Americas. Okay, I'm talking that long? The current food security crisis presents an opportunity for the region to not just help and the pressing food crisis in the region, but to supply an even greater share of the world's food supply. If we can invest in the farmers and agricultural communities, that will help us meet that goal. And we're doing that in Guatemala, for instance, which is one of approximately 50 countries receiving an additional supplemental on food security that was made available in response to Russia's war on Ukraine. And that funding is being used to really combat the effects of rising food, fuel, and fertilizer prices. And then let me just say a few words that, you know, we're focusing on nutrition. Sorry, I'm going to skip down. I guess in summary, I'll say a few more things. One is just to note that globally, some 23 million people have been lifted out of poverty through the Feed the Future initiative through its first 10 years. And we've seen countries like Ethiopia, Ghana, and Bangladesh that prioritize investments in agricultural productivity have accelerated reductions in both poverty and malnutrition, and that's put them in a much better position to deal with today's crisis. And through our network of 21 Feed the Future Innovation Labs, we develop and scale the best of U.S. agricultural ingenuity and expertise. And of course, these innovation labs collaborate with universities and other research centers in partnership countries to develop future generations of global food security leaders. And happy to talk more about. We do a lot of great work with the innovation labs. Given the gap between the global need and the public sector resources, we're leveraging our investments and forging partnerships that bring innovative and impactful results. For example, Feed the Future partners with more than 50 U.S. companies, including Fortune 500s, to align and focus corporate social responsibility efforts addressing hunger and poverty, and we also partner with the private sector in countries where we operate. And so this is really critical to creating jobs and sustaining that long-term economic growth. We engage directly with farmer organizations, nonprofit communities, community and faith-based groups, and others across civil society to expand the reach of our programs to local communities. We have a long-standing commitment to partnering with and alongside faith-based and community organizations to advance shared development and humanitarian goals, including food security efforts. And faith-based communities serve some of the most vulnerable populations in the world and have a long worked at the front lines responding to hunger and food insecurity. And I believe some of those organizations are probably here in the room today. And as many of you know firsthand, they're often, faith-based organizations are often the first in and the last to leave, and are really uniquely positioned to identify and meet local needs. So we collaborate also with everyday Americans who are enthusiastic about ending global hunger, from food processing experts at major U.S. companies to farmer-to-farmer volunteers. And so while this food crisis is global in scale, there are steps all of us can take, we know, and we've seen the generosity of the diaspora communities, private companies, and individuals in response to the crisis like the one that we're facing today. So as the name of this summit so aptly states, it is critical for all of us, from individuals, civil society organizations, private sector companies, faith-based organizations, governments, and more, really to come together at the table as you have done the last few days and as you're doing right now to address this crisis. So thanks for the opportunity. I said I couldn't possibly talk this long, but then you gave me the leeway, and so I kind of drifted, but thank you.
Okay, we have a little bit of time for some questions. We're going to do a couple of things. I have one here to get us started that someone already shared. But if the rest of you, if anyone has a question they want to raise their hand while Ms. Boyle is talking, I'll walk to you and let you speak into the microphone your question. Or if you want to write it down in case we don't get time to cover everyone's questions, we will be sure we get them to her. She was very eager to have any and all of your questions so that she could know what's on your minds and what you're thinking. So I'll start with this question. USAID has a balance, they have to balance a critical tension, one of serving international communities well, and also ultimately answering to a U.S. constituency. And USAID has really emphasized prioritizing localization But is that possible while we're also putting U.S. interest first? And what are some of the effective steps that USAID has taken to advance localization? That's a lot.
That's. I don't have any chocolate to hand out, right? It's a great question, yes. Look, do you want me to answer now?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on the localization and balancing U.S. interests, I mean, I think we talked a little bit of why it's within U.S. interest, right, to engage on the global stage in terms of not just the moral obligation, but really as security for our country. And then also lots related to just supply chains and creating jobs here in the U.S. And then a lot of the innovations that we invest in, for example, through the innovation labs. I'll give an example in some researchers that we worked through in an innovation lab. I think it was black bean. They developed 2 varieties of black bean that now Michigan, in the state of Michigan, 90% of their black bean are grown from these 2 varieties. And there's a whole host of other innovations I could share with you that were made for global purpose but are being used here also in the U.S. When it comes to localization, I mean, I think we all know, like, my 3 I's, my inclusivity, if we don't implement our programs where we're trying to impact lives together with the people that we're trying to help so that they have voice in designing the most impactful way to go about our business, we will never be as successful as we potentially could be. And I think that's why localization is such an important initiative, and it means many, many different things. The way that USAID is implementing it, yes, it's how we're working with host country governments, how we're working with local organizations, faith-based organizations, civil society, and how we're linking that up with all of our partners here in the U.S. I mean, some of the partners in the room that work with USAID already could also speak to how they engage very closely with local partners on the ground. So it kind of answers it, but yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. And we're supported by USAID. I run an innovation lab out of K-State. So first I wanted to thank you for your support. And I have to say that the dedication and brilliance of the people at USAID is really unmatched. So the flagship position you have as a development agency is very well earned. My question is, as we sit here today and we look at the horizon of ending poverty in the U.S., ending hunger in the U.S., Feed the Future over the next 10 years, what have we learned from this program that was born out of the last food insecurity shock, now that we're enduring just these multiple shocks in a row, and it seems to be the new normal? What would you have in terms of advice for us as we seek to improve how we're doing for the next 10 years?
I think it's a fantastic question, and it was one that we were asking ourselves before this current crisis of Russia's war on Ukraine. We were developing the global food security strategy, the revised or new strategy that really, we reached out to a wide group of stakeholders and looked at, like, the pandemic. You know, what was the impact of COVID, and how do we implement that? We looked at climate much more strongly than we had in the first iteration. So obviously those things are really important, as well as conflict. I would say also, though, that looking at how we engage with the private sector and how we leverage, and we really need to accelerate if we're going to meet the goals that, you know, that you just underscored. Like, we cannot do that without accelerating and scaling what we do. So I think there's a lot of innovations and solutions that have been identified, but we struggle to get them into the market, or even if they're in the market, we struggle to get them to the smallholder farmers or small enterprises that we're trying to work with. So looking for those solutions and then those partnerships to scale, I think, would be something that, anyway, I would underscore. I think there's lots of other things I could say, but I'll just, yeah.
Right here.
Hi, I have a question. Please forgive my seat. So my name is Liz. Thank you for your presentation. And Bishop Michael Curry talked about when we're trying to address these issues, he says, first, let's think about what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And then second, who are the people that are involved? And my question for you that he addressed also was, or that he lifted up, is who profits? Who profits by this problem staying in place, because I think that's important for us to pay attention to, because I'm not a do-gooder. Like, I'm after justice, right? But thinking about who profits by this problem staying in place, what would you say to that?
That's a tough question. I mean, the initiative that I described, Feed the Future, is very much focused on ending hunger, malnutrition, and poverty. So by not doing that, who profits? Maybe, I don't know, corrupt government, corrupt business. I mean, it sort of goes against my own brain, like why you wouldn't want to do that. So I think it's, yeah, probably there are people always making money, right? So I don't know. I struggle to answer your question, but I will take it away with me and think about it a lot. I don't know if you have an answer to it, or anybody else in the room can answer that one, but it is a good question to be asking. Yeah. Because I think we lose as a country. I think countries lose. If people are not lifted up out of poverty, if people are struggling with hunger and malnutrition, then how can an economy thrive? You know, so countries lose, because without that, other things start falling apart. So the U.S. has nothing to gain from that. But maybe there's individuals that are malign and corrupt that do gain. I don't know.
Thank you so much. Any other last minute questions? I didn't see any other hands. I want to make sure I didn't miss anyone. Okay. Will y'all join me in thanking Ms. Boyle?